So I'm delighted to welcome Caroline Levine to deliver the Sarah Cutts Freirichs Lecture, which is an endowed series that showcases scholars working in the 19th century on topics of broad import. Caroline Levine, who is the David and Kathleen Ryan Professor of Humanities at Cornell, certainly more than meets this description, as she is one of the most distinctive and influential voices not only in 19th century studies, but in literary studies and the humanities and the arts more broadly. Her work is committed to advancing humanistic methods with respect to core political commitments, most notably to strengthening democracy, promoting social justice, and more recently, addressing the increasingly urgent issue of climate change. This last is the topic of her 2023 book, The Activist Humanist: Form and Method in the Climate Crisis, and will also be the subject of her talk this afternoon. This new book makes the case that much work within literary studies and the humanities more broadly only gestures toward political futures, avoiding the necessary impurities of worldly action and institution building and transformation. The Activist Humanist extends the arguments of her 2015 book, Forms, Whole Rhythm Hierarchy Network, which won the James Russell Lowell Prize of the Modern Language Association. Forms was and is an extremely important book, and if you haven't read it, you should. It starts from the frame-shifting premise that literary scholars have created a disabling and inaccurate distinction between aesthetic form and social causality, occluding the ways in which the social world is itself structured by complex forms. By imagining, for example, that certain forms of power are the underlying cause of certain formal reflections or responses, literary methods have advanced reductive understandings of power and culture and have limited the capacity to imagine and enact meaningful change in the world. In other words, the causes are monoliths that aren't examined: ideology, neoliberalism, racism. It's not that these forces don't operate in powerful ways, but that a more complex and granular understanding of their forms will introduce many possible points of intervention and many actual forms of collision. This also implies a shift away from a singular focus on radical transformation to the messiness of multiple strategies of institution building and political change. So here you can see how this analysis chimes with the starting point of the activist humanist. Caroline Levine is also the author of two earlier books, The Serious Pleasures of Suspense, Victorian Realism and Narrative Doubt, which won the Perkins Prize for the best book in narrative studies, and Provoking Democracy: Why We Need the Arts. In all of her work, she brings a wide-ranging perspective to bear on illuminating examples, exemplifying a critical temperament and method that demonstrates the value of the humanities in real time. Caroline is also a generous interlocutor. She came to Brown just last April to serve as a distinguished commentator for the Collaborative Public Workshop, which is the culminating public event of the capstone course of the Collaborative Humanities Doctoral Certificate. She responded with extraordinary care and insight to papers across several humanistic disciplines, generating thoughtful dialogue and demonstrating the spirit of open-minded inquiry and deep commitment that marks all of her scholarly and institutional work. Caroline's talk this evening is titled Studying the Novel in the Climate Crisis: A Tale of Three Pipelines. The talk will be followed by a reception out in the gallery. Please join me in welcoming Professor Levine to the Kogut Institute and Brown.
I think maybe I had a dream once that Amanda Anderson summarized and praised my work, and it just came true. It was really very exciting. Thank you so much, Amanda. It's a real thrill to be here, and so many people I admire, and some of you I've met in person before, and some of you I haven't, so I am really thrilled to be able to present my work here. The framework for all of my thinking in recent years has been the climate crisis, and I'm really haunted by the fact that we're We have about 5 years before the planet will hit these irreversible and catastrophic tipping points, and we won't be able to come back from that. And so I'm constantly asking, what can we do to stop the worst from happening? And it turns out this is a very unfamiliar question in literary studies. Most scholars argue that we can raise awareness or understand historical causes, but it's not our job to formulate practical actions. It's fine for our spare time, maybe, but definitely not part of our job description. It's taken me some time to figure out why we're so opposed to the question of action, and part of it definitely has to do with the very long tradition that goes back to Seneca and St. Jerome of separating scholarly knowledge from the rough and tumble of the world. So this very long argument that the scholar is supposed to turn away from the corrupt world of the polis in order to have true knowledge, which in fact in those early years is otherworldly knowledge. So it's really about rejecting this world in favor of the other one. But there's also a more modern left political case against practical action that's rooted in critical theory and pervasive across schools of thought in literary studies now. I've become increasingly convinced that Adorno's thinking about art and politics in particular is underlying a lot of work in our field in our time, even work that doesn't cite him or seem particularly indebted to the Frankfurt School. So I want to start by focusing on a common thread I see across literary studies, and that is the focus on ruptures. So critics often demand dramatic ruptures from current conditions, and the idea is that the break would be so complete and comprehensive that it would be literally unrepresentable. What comes after the break would be unrepresentable. So various different kinds of voices make this argument, and I want to draw attention to their range on purpose to think about how this is happening across the field. So Foucault, for example, writes, "To imagine another system is to extend our participation in the current system." So we're so stuck inside this one that anytime we try to imagine what's going to come after or beyond it, we just end up reinforcing what we already know. Adorno, who's very much unlike Foucault in many ways, writes, "One may not cast a picture of utopia in a positive manner. What's productive instead," Adorno says, "is to draw attention to what's missing, the determined negation of that which merely is, which always points at the same time to what should be." So according to this logic, we do our best political work when we dwell in a kind of endless negation. So we're focusing always on the limits of what is in order to point beyond it to something other, but that something other has to be left undefined. So you can see this argument all over the place in the field. For Frederick Jameson, it is crucial to bring home our constitutional inability to imagine utopia itself, and this not owing to any individual failure of imagination, but as the result of the systemic, cultural, and ideological closure of which we are all, one way or another, prisoners. Jared Sexton argues that we must reach for an indiscernible something beyond the world as we know it, imagining it in and as the ruins of being after the end of the world in an entirely other relation to the nothing from whence it comes. Or as Jack Halberstam puts it, revolution will come in a form we cannot yet imagine, can't say what new structures will replace the ones we live with yet, because once we've torn shit down, we'll inevitably see more and see differently and feel a new sense of wanting and being and becoming. So it follows from these arguments that the arts are particularly valuable because they don't prescribe actions or solutions. So they make us sit with complexity and ambiguity and slippage. And so force us to kind of recognize the limits of what we can know and perceive. And then also another reason that the aesthetic is so valuable, according to this argument, is that when we're experiencing a poem or a painting, we're not rushing around trying to get other things done. So aesthetic experience opens up a space to pause and reflect and break us free from the prison house of the everyday. Thinkers across the arts and humanities have been arguing that this kind of refusal of plans and programs is especially urgent right now because we live in a historical moment when corporations and governments are pushing us to turn every aspect of our lives to financial profit. I think there's a lot of validity to this argument, but I've been struck in recent years by how dominant it is. So I myself wrote 3 books that took this position so much for granted that I couldn't even formulate an alternative. So I've been tracking its dominance, making a hobby of looking at the ends of books and essays in literary studies, and finding that almost every book or article ends with open-endedness, the deliberate refusal to spell out the future. So again, I want to give you just this broad range. Catherine Gallagher and Stephen Greenblatt write, "We sincerely hope that you will not be able to say what it all adds up to. If you could, we would have failed." Sarah Ahmed's Cultural Politics of Emotion closes this way: "Justice involves feelings. Where we go with these feelings remains an open question." Here's the ending of Timothy Morton's Hyperobjects. Heidegger said that only a God can save us now. We just don't know what sort of a God. Robert McRuer concludes Crip theory with the, quote, "promise that we will always comprehend disability otherwise and that we will collectively somehow access other worlds and other futures." Dora Zhang reclaims description on the ground that it challenges teleology and instrumentality. At the end of Black Aliveness, Kevin Quashie issues a call that vibrates beyond the scope of the rule of the world as we know it. And for Tim Buse, who tells me he's on a research trip, the novel matters because it gives us access to a thought that in its essence refuses the ideological formulations of our world. So it follows from all of these different critics that we should stay away from practical politics, because any engagement with practical politics would just reaffirm the dominations of the present. So there are lots of examples of people actually deliberately saying no to practical politics. And Jose Munoz in Cruising Utopia is one. He says, if you fight for what he calls gay pragmatism, you'll just re-entrench the corrupt and bankrupt moral order, social order. Now, most importantly for my own purposes, most eco-critics have embraced some version of the logic of the radical rupture that requires no action in the present. So I've been especially interested in arguments for the importance of science fiction and fantasy as imagining a world that has broken already dramatically from our present. So I want to consider, just briefly, Melody Jou's reading of the novel Lagoon by Nnedi Okorafor. Although Lagoon is not the kind of realistic roadmap that shows exactly how to bring a more utopian future into being, the arrival of aliens is the event that seeds the possibility of a rupture with the oil consumption that sustains our lived experience of modernity. Imagining that this rupture has already occurred frees Okorafor from explaining how the rupture might occur, enabling her to venture into the important work of world building and imagining new forms of post-colonial feminist science in its foamy wake. So for Jou, it's crucial that Okorafor does not show the steps that it takes to make a new world. And because she skips over those steps, she can do the important work of imagining an alternative. So the novel is politically valuable because it doesn't explain how to get us from here to there. So what all these scholars across these very different schools of thought have in common is the determination to skip over the conditions of the present and leave a gap where action right now might take shape. For me, often the implications of this are terrifying. Here's just one example. Instead of taking any kind of action, Anahid Nersessian argues we have to face the traumatic knowledge that climate catastrophe is certain and unfathomable. So here's the sense that because we can't or shouldn't act, we have to resign ourselves to death and suffering on an unprecedented scale. Now, if literary critics of all stripes are actively discouraging us from figuring out how to take political action in the present, and they're making the structures of like corporations and governments feel monolithic and immovable, then they're doing exactly what we usually call ideology. That is, making us feel like there are no alternatives to the status quo, and so, persuading us to acquiesce to that status quo because we can't figure out any kind of action to change the world. And I've been increasingly convinced that this emphasis on inaction in literary studies is in fact dominant ideology, because we see it everywhere around us. So I'm constantly told, as I go about my climate activist work, that there's no point in doing it. There's no point in taking any kind of action. From this perspective, then, literary critics are not actually challenging outsiders at all. We're just humming along with the mainstream. So instead of aesthetic breaks and ruptures, I want to make the case that the core work of literary and cultural studies is now becoming uncomfortably consonant with domination and exploitation. So I want to focus particularly on what I think of as this kind of one of these core values that goes along with the rupture, which is open-endedness, the fact that we can't plan for anything to come, and that the future is always and necessarily unknown. And I want to think about the politics of open-endedness right now. So first of all, as fossil fuels disrupt lives around the world with storms, floods, droughts, wildfires, and of course, hurricanes just in the past week, people's lives have gotten more open-ended, but not in a good way. When you're not sure where to find your next meal or a safe place to sleep, ambiguity and uncertainty are not probably going to be primarily a source of pleasure and excitement. Artists and intellectuals have been dismissive about ideas like predictability and security for more than a century, but it also seems to me that these have been much too easy for the privileged to take for granted. So it seems to me when your food and your home and your water sources are doubtful and precarious, predictability and security are going to be exactly the kind of thing you may be longing for. Secondly, so fossil fuels disruption, first of all, is part of the politics of open-endedness. Secondly, authoritarian leaders on the right have been as much in love with rupturing rules and institutions as any avant-garde artist. So the Trump administration rolled back over 100 environmental regulations, including laws against fracking on native lands, drilling in wildlife preserves, and dumping toxins in waterways. He lifted the ban on exploring for oil and gas in Alaska and permitted the building of disastrous new pipelines. Now, third, climate denialism itself is strangely consistent with the humanistic value of open-endedness. So, as many of you may know, historians Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway, trawled through millions of pages of documents from the oil companies to discover that they have known for a very long time, back to the 1980s, that fossil fuels were going to destroy life on the planet, but they wanted to keep selling oil anyway, so they conducted a very deliberate campaign that was focused on doubt and skepticism around climate science. So they deliberately wanted to make people think that the science was open-ended, and that there was a lot of debate about causes and solutions. So big oil actually wanted to make lots of us think that the best response to climate change was to pause and wonder rather than to take action. Tech companies also have been big fans of an open-ended and exciting future, and they often brag about freeing workers from traditional schedules and cubicles. But of course, that kind of open-endedness also has brought with it a terrible precarity for a lot of the labor force as workers struggle to make ends meet in the gig economy, stringing together multiple unpredictable jobs. So I want to be clear, I don't mean to suggest that humanists in love with open-endedness should be blamed for the climate crisis, or that we should stop enjoying or teaching challenging and disruptive works of art. But I do think that stability is too easy to devalue or overlook for those of us who have it. And I want to make the case that our dominant values in literary studies are now getting in the way of the kinds of political action that could actually address the ravages of climate change. For novel critics, I want to suggest this means rethinking our relationship to endings. So, in part, thanks to our love affair with open-endedness, there's very little we critics dislike more than endings. Teleology is one of those words you can say in a disgusted tone without having to explain why it is that it's a problem. And of course, we reserve our deepest contempt for happy endings. Marxists argue that happy endings offer false resolutions to real social contradictions. For feminist and queer critics, the end of the conventional marriage plot is especially troubling, but all kinds of other narratives also end by normalizing deviance, domesticating eros, or turning queerness into identity. The contempt for happy endings has been especially important to critical accounts of the 19th century novel. D.A. Miller famously defines the narratable as a logic of disequilibrium, deficiency, and deferral, a kind of logic that trains us to yearn for closure. So all of these lacks that push us to want closure. The critical tradition is focused a lot on certain kinds of insufficiency, like romantic desire, like social exclusion, like false accusation. And it's true that the novel often resolves these kinds of instabilities through an integration of the self with the dominant moral and social order. But critics have had a lot less to say about the kind of plotted insufficiency that's been drawing my own political attention in the climate crisis, and that is narratives that are propelled by material scarcity. I call these plots of precarity. The 19th century novel is full of these. Oliver Twist is probably the most famous. The plot gets going in earnest when Oliver asks for more food. But the novel across borders in the 19th century is interested in precarity. Now, many of these novels have happy endings, and what the endings of these plots often promise is a future of predictable food and shelter. So I want to look at the ending of George Moore's 1894 novel, Esther Waters, which I highly recommend if you haven't read it. It's little read, but a fantastic novel. So for most of the narrative, we're following the illiterate character Esther through trouble after trouble. So she has a baby out of wedlock, she has an abusive stepfather, she has a period in the workhouse, trouble finding employment, run-ins with the police. But in the final section, Esther concludes by falling into a life of regularity with her employer, Mrs. Barfield. In the evening, they sat in the library sewing, or Mrs. Barfield read aloud, or they talked of their sons. On Sundays, they had their meetings. In this final stage of the novel, where everything is nice and smooth, Esther's employer asks her if she would like to marry again. She responds, "Marry and begin life over again? All of that worry and bother over again? Why should I marry?" In place of the worry and bother of the marriage plot, then, the two women agree to work on to the end. So you can tell from the exact duplication of the phrasing, we are not talking about narratable adventure. Instead, we are talking about, for what's for Esther, the first genuine prospect of a sustainable life, reliable food, and the regular rituals of labor and religious observance. And I love the way Moore is very clear here that marriage is not the way that women will end up with this stable futurity. He insists on the importance of the actual material routines that sustain bodies and communities over time. So the happy endings of plots of precarity invite us to pay a deliberate attention to ongoingness, the project of sustaining life over time. Of course, this has always been true of the happily ever after, right? It promises a future of sameness. Even the ending of Pride and Prejudice, perhaps the consummate marriage plot, goes out of its way to note the ongoing effort to stave off precarity. And here I'm talking about keeping Lydia going. So in the final pages of the novel, Elizabeth won't let the Wickhams appeal to Darcy for money, but such relief as it was in her power to afford by the practice of what might be called economy in her own private expenses, she frequently sent to the Wickhams. It had always been evident to her that such an income as theirs, under the direction of two persons so extravagant in their wants and heedless of the future, must be very insufficient to their support. And whenever they changed their quarters, either Jane or herself were sure of being applied to for some little assistance towards discharging their bills. Austen is not a radical, so she's very happy to remind us that this is part of Lydia's moral failing, but she also goes out of her way to promise to keep the Wickhams alive into the future with frequent small sums. So when it comes to the happy ending of the 19th century novel, it's typically the case that closure is continuity. And that's politically interesting, I think, because continuity is exactly what seems to me to be of crucial importance right now, as the steady flow of clean water, nutritious food, and stable shelter are all increasingly rare and under threat. The thinker who seems to me to best articulate the political importance of continuity is Potawatomi philosopher Kyle Powys White, who coins the term collective continuance. So for White, it's unjust to disrupt the ways that different communities thrive and maintain themselves over time, including access to clean water and sustainable food systems. And this allows him to make a powerful critique of settler colonialism. When I read his argument, it hit me like a thunderbolt. It just shifted my own focus in this kind of sudden and powerful way towards collective continuance, and then I stopped defaulting to open-endedness and started thinking seriously about stability, predictability, continuity, all values I spent my whole professional life rejecting. And instead of calling for an unknowable world, I started thinking about what is involved in the hard work of building and maintaining stable conditions for collective life. So because I had been working on form already, I started to think that we do have methods in literary analysis, the methods of formalism, that can help us build for continuity rather than sticking only to open-endedness. So for some years, I've been arguing for an expansive formalist method. In literary studies, the word form typically refers to the patterns, shapes, and structures that organize literary texts, like plot or meter. I deliberately define form more broadly than that as any shape or configuration of materials, any arrangement of elements, any ordering or patterning. Politics, according to this definition, is very much a matter of form. So we have constant battles around spatial borders, which are spatial forms. We also have lots of debates over organizations of time, and I think probably the most important one that we've been focused on in the humanities for several decades is the idea of time being organized by European powers at the forefront of progress with everyone else lagging along behind, and we've been wanting to retell that story. The form that probably produces the most suffering is the hierarchical division. So in this sense, politics is the work of giving form to collective life. Now, it's certainly true that many political forms, including racial hierarchies and national borders, are oppressive and violent. And it's because of forms like these that lots of radical thinkers have wanted to say that all forms should be disrupted. There's a dream of freedom from all formal constraints that I think is at the heart of libertarian impulses on both right and left. But I also think that that goes against something we know about living in common. All human communities, and most non-human ones too, depend on orderings, shapes, and arrangements just for the ordinary project of day-to-day survival. And it's been my argument that scholars of the arts have the methods to make sense of the various forms that give shape to collective life. So just as we might track the intersections of narration, plot, and gender in the novel, we can analyze the routines, pathways, and enclosures that structure the social world. Now, to some critics of my work, this expansion has sounded grandiose or even to some delusional, but I want to just make clear that my argument is specifically methodological. So just as a historian can use historical methods to study the causes of the Russian Revolution or a childbirth, or just as a statistician can count microbes or incarcerated people, a critic can use formalist methods to analyze the plot of a Bildungsroman or the arrangement of a social hierarchy. And I also want to point out that the movement back and forth between literary forms and social forms is already kind of an ordinary practice in the field of literary studies. No one is surprised, for example, when a literary scholar reads the jolting rhythms of language and poetry in relation to, say, railway travel. And here are just a few examples of articles that do just that. So we're already moving back and forth between social forms and aesthetic forms in a lot of the work that we do that doesn't necessarily call itself formalist. So I've taken the critiques of my work very seriously, but they still haven't persuaded me that we can't use formalist methods to interpret all kinds of shaped and patterned things, including social hierarchies and transportation systems. These are not aesthetic in the Adornian sense, but they are designed and made things, artifices that impose order on bodies, objects, and ideas. From this perspective, the social world is filled with well-wrought forms. Now, when I started focusing on the social forms that sustain collective life over time, I was a little surprised to realize that there just aren't an infinite number of ways to organize human communities. As I argue in my most recent book, all collectives rely on routines of food and rest, pathways for water and waste, and sheltering enclosures. Now, of course, it's possible to survive with unpredictable food and unreliable shelter. People have done that, but for most, that irregularity is painful and it can be torturous or even catastrophic. So these forms restrict us, but they also sustain us, and they're what make living in common possible. This work has persuaded me that the just society of the future is not, in fact, radically unknowable. I think we have a pretty good idea about some of the fundamental forms we're going to need for collective continuance, and that means that we can use formalist methods to help us build a more just world. So, how to go about this question of figuring out which forms are good for collective continuance? Now, across my own work, I've argued that most forms have multiple affordances, so you can't just say that any given form is either good or bad, like openness is good and teleology is bad. One example might be an enclosed room like this, which is great for allowing us to hear each other and talk without having the wind and the rain come in or noise from outside. But it also excludes a lot of people who can't get here for various kinds of reasons, transportation, national borders, money. So it's both good and bad. It's both something that we probably don't want to give up, the enclosed room for speaking to each other, but we know it's also exclusive. So I think it's a political mistake to argue for or against any particular form. And in my book Forms, I argued for the affirmative affordances of the hierarchy, for example. And it's also a mistake always to argue for breaking free from forms because some are capacitating, some are oppressive, and some are both at the same time. So in this context, I keep returning to the happy endings in the 19th century plots of precarity because these point to the surprisingly affirmative affordances of teleology as a form. For example, they can lead us to value forms of collective continuance that are under threat, like stable shelter and clean water. And if we see affirmative political possibilities in teleology, then that's kind of the whole show. That is, it has to move us away from a relentless emphasis on open-endedness as the only good. If there's even one affirmative affordance to teleology, then this has to upset the apple cart of literary studies. So as I started thinking about the affirmative affordances of teleology, I learned that it turns out to be a crucial form for successful activist struggle. I'm just going to talk very briefly about the Montgomery bus boycott, which organizers knew was going to have to last a really long time. It was going to have to draw large range of sympathetic supporters. It was going to have to wear down the opposition. They also knew that it was going to be hard to keep everybody going through the long slog of a boycott that ended up lasting 13 months. So what did they do to keep people going, as they did successfully? One of the organizers, civil rights lawyer Fred D. Gray, said, people must have something to look forward to. So it was the telos, the shared goal, that gave collective meaning and purpose to the arduous daily work of boycotting and inspired people to keep going even when the going was really hard. So here's a case where teleology doesn't only reinforce the status quo, it also affords activist victories and the shaping of the social world for justice. And the happy ending of winning in Montgomery didn't make people complacent either. It made change seem possible, and so helped to spread civil rights activism across the Jim Crow South. So I'm going to come back to teleology in the novel in a few minutes, but right now I want to use the formalist methods I learned from studying the novel to analyze a form that's been really important to environmentalists, and that's the pipeline. As forms, pipelines are usually tubular in shape. They do start somewhere and they end somewhere else, but their beginnings and endings aren't usually dramatic or definitive. What they most importantly afford is continuity or flow. In fact, I think pipelines are formally a lot like the endless ending of plots of precarity. The point is to just keep going smoothly and predictably into the distant future. Now, we know that there are at least 3 ways that oil and gas pipelines afford terrible injustices. First of all, they're often planned to run through communities of color and indigenous treaty territories, destroying lands and waterways that are crucial to collective continuance. Second, oil and gas pipelines threaten life and health. So every oil and gas pipeline is a kind of carbon bomb, producing millions of tons of greenhouse gas emissions, but they're also constantly subject to toxic spills and leaks. So if Line 3 leaked under the Mississippi River, it would poison the water that literally millions of people rely on. And these kinds of accidents happen all the time. So the most famous is probably BP's Gulf of Mexico oil spill, which won a safety award on the day that the explosion set off a fire that couldn't be put out with a well gushing oil deep underwater for months. Okay, so we know some of the bad affordances: the destruction of communities of color, global warming, spills, and leaks. But I want to spend a little time with the third reason to object to pipelines, which is what interests me most about the form from the perspective of narrative theory, and that is the way that pipelines impose order on time. I'm going to use the example here of the Pacific Northwest fracked gas pipeline, which has just gotten the go-ahead for expansion. Washington Governor Jay Inslee has been objecting to it strenuously, and I just want to look at his words for why it should not have been allowed to go ahead. This decision essentially locks in long-term capital investments that prevent us from reaching our national and state climate goals. It makes no sense to shackle ourselves to a source of energy whose costs will go up in the coming decades. So, literary critics, all of you will have noticed what I noticed, which I suspect, the language of locking, right? It's going to lock in capital investments, it's going to shackle us to pipelines in the future. And he's not wrong. So putting money into building new fossil fuel pipelines right now mean that fossil fuels will remain the default in those places for the future. Because once they're in the ground, it becomes much harder to shift to renewable alternatives. Investors don't want to close down a multi-million-dollar investment before it's been fully paid off. And then when gas is the norm, you have to go out of your way to install wind or solar, and so that's inconvenient and it's expensive. And that means that infrastructural investments, especially in pipelines, are ways of ensuring that oil and gas remain the default setting. The term for this is carbon lock-in. That is, new infrastructure that commits us to fossil fuels for its lifetime. So the Pacific Northwest pipeline has a life expectancy of around 50 years. And here are a bunch of other lifetimes of fossil fuel infrastructures. So one of the crucial affordances of pipelines is continuity over long periods. Now, this understanding of the pipeline form has also given shape to my own activism. So if we're going to prevent carbon lock-in, which seems to me to be an incredibly high priority, we need to stop installing fossil fuel infrastructures, and that's why pipeline protests are a particularly important form of political action. Now, not everyone lives near a pipeline, as Bill McKibben likes to say, but everyone lives near a pot of money that is supporting fossil fuels. So my own activist energy has been going to stopping the financing of new pipelines. Pension funds are a major driver of the climate crisis, with just 23 investors holding 50% of all institutional investments in fossil fuels. Sorry, the text is so small, but Vanguard and BlackRock are up there at numbers 1 and 2. Now, my own group is called TIAA Divest, and we're putting pressure on the $1.3 trillion pension giant TIAA, which is the major manager of retirement funds for colleges and universities across the United States, including right here at Brown University. Now, TIA does not tell us what they're investing in, but we worked with a group of finance detectives who discovered that they're managing at least $78 billion in fossil fuel assets. $78 billion. So TIA is financing new fossil fuel infrastructure right now with my money and yours. And because it seems incredibly important to stop the flow of money to new pipelines, that's been the focus of my own activism. But you might remember that I said a few minutes ago that forms aren't in themselves simply good or bad, and that's given shape to an unfamiliar environmentalist question in my own work. That is, if pipelines lock in the future, could we use them for good, to lock in not climate destruction, but equality or justice for the long term? Could they help us to create virtuous rather than vicious cycles? I think the answer is yes. So here I want to turn to a second pipeline, which is a very ancient form, and that is the water pipeline. Clean water pathways are among the essential forms for collective continuance. All human groups have had to find or build pathways to bring water to and from the places where they live and gather. And right now, from Flint to Lagos, many of the world's poorest people are suffering from unpredictable and unsafe water flows. So this is already an urgent political problem, and it's only going to get much worse as the climate crisis intensifies. So is it possible to design waterways for collective continuance? Again, I think the answer is yes. My favorite examples are the forms designed by Amazigh people, often called Berbers, the indigenous people of North Africa. Water sharing in Amazigh societies is often organized around a strict timetable, and that's a form we, of course, usually associate with Foucauldian discipline and industrial labor, but I want to suggest it has very different affordances in this Amazigh context. So each village along a waterway might be assigned one day of the week for irrigating crops, and then families further subdivide access by hours of the day. And that's fair because water evaporates at different rates at different times of the day and year. So the form of the timetable affords fair distributions through periods of scarcity and periods of abundance. And it also blocks water hoarding, so it conserves water for the long term. Now, rural Amazigh people have also built pipelines to lock in equitable water sharing over time. So in Morocco and Algeria, you can see pathways that guide water down from the mountains to the plains in shapes that look a little like fish bones. There's usually one main waterway and then multiple smaller channels that branch off to carry water to different households. And the whole point is to get equal distributions of water to people who live further away from the water source as well as people who live closer to it. Large Amazigh cities have also organized water pipelines according to another form, an Islamic hierarchy. So the Prophet Muhammad insists on water sharing, and he says that the first priority should always be given to people's drinking water, second to animals, third to farming, and fourth to pumps and mills. So the city of Fez in the 12th and 13th century organized water pipelines according to this hierarchy, and they're still working. So one network transports drinkable water by canals to private homes as well as 70 public fountains, so every human can get access to clean water. Another transports clean water but undrinkable for cleaning and tanning and dyeing, and then a third takes wastewater out of the city to the Cebu River. So Amazigh pipelines are both just and sustainable formal models for collective continuance. And I have been arguing that these are great designs that we could copy and build elsewhere. But of course, that claim goes against one of our most deeply held political values in the humanities, which is that we should honor cultural specificity and heterogeneity. And you might be thinking to yourselves that it's particularly objectionable for me to be appropriating indigenous knowledge. But what strikes me most forcibly about Amazigh methods for distributing water is precisely their abstraction. That is, like Foucault's prison timetables, these regular hierarchies and timetables are exactly the kinds of forms that move readily across time and space. And that's because abstract patterns don't belong to particular cultures in the same way that practices, meanings, and values do. And I do think an investment in egalitarian water pipelines could lock us into a long future of collective continuance, as we see from Fez, many centuries of egalitarian water access, a virtuous rather than a vicious cycle. Now, I promised a third pipeline. We had oil and gas and water, and now I want to turn to the career pipeline for underrepresented minority populations. Although it's a much more metaphorical use of the word, I'd argue that it's still a form. It's still an arrangement of resources. So the career pipeline tries to take down barriers and increase access to education and mentoring from early in one's life onward. The goal of the career pipeline is precisely to smooth the pathway, to make it less like an obstacle course and more like an open pipe. And the idea is that this continuous flow is going to give shape to a more just future. So this is a chart of Black professors of chemistry in the United States. And so the idea is that the more Black professors are teaching college chemistry classes, the more Black students will be able to imagine themselves doing that work, and the more who enter the profession will mentor and smooth the way for generations to follow. So again, a virtuous rather than a vicious cycle. So I've been using the methods I learned in literary studies to pay attention to how these forms work. And as a student of the novel, I'm especially drawn to the ways that pipeline forms shape experience over time. But I've also been interested in the literal stories we could be telling about pipelines. So one of the things I've noticed in teaching climate change every semester is that my students are mostly pretty cynical about activism. They don't think that it works. And it turns out that they haven't heard about like the amazing accomplishments of ACT UP, for example, ending not only saving millions of lives, but ending insurance exclusions for people with pre-existing conditions and fast-tracking experimental drugs. They also don't know that governments, scientists, and activists came together to heal the ozone layer. And there are all kinds of stories of activist victories in the climate movement that don't get covered. So this amazing story about activists in South Memphis stopping the Byhalia pipeline was only ever a local news story, so we don't hear about it. I do think there's an appetite for activist stories out there. Here's some examples of what I call activist narratives. You can see there's not a lot of climate activism represented here. But all of these have very classic happy endings. Now, I know a lot of sophisticated people like you prefer subtle and complex stories to simple ones, but the fossil fuel industry would actually make a great villain in a classic story between good and evil because they are in fact genuinely bad guys. They've been deliberately manipulating us for decades, and I think it's time to take back the narrative. So I mentioned the Merchants of Doubt earlier, but there are other ways in which the story has been in their hands. So for example, in the 1980s, the public started getting worried about rising amounts of plastic waste, and there were actually bills being introduced into Congress to limit plastics. And the plastics industry, which is also the oil and gas industry, because most plastics are fossil fuel products, they called a meeting. The feeling was the plastics industry was under fire. We got to do what it takes to take the heat off because we want to continue to make plastic products. That's Larry Thomas, former president of the Society of the Plastics Industry. So what did they do to keep making plastics? They started pushing the benefits of recycling, despite knowing that very few plastics would actually ever be successfully recycled. So worldwide, no recycling program has ever gone above 9% of plastics recycled. Now that campaign is still very much with us. Whenever I talk to people about environmentalism, the first thing they bring up to me is, I recycle, or often, my neighbor doesn't recycle properly. That's more what I get. Now, the most troubling aspect of the story, to my mind, is that the plastics industry kept recycling not just to keep us hooked on buying plastic, which is bad enough, but to get us to think that if we recycled, we were doing enough for the environment and didn't have to think about oil and gas. So here's Larry Thomas again. If the public thinks that recycling is working, then they are not going to be as concerned about the environment. the public thinks recycling is working, then they're not going to be as concerned about the environment. Studies show this is true. People think that if they've recycled, they've done their bit for climate change, when in fact we know that that's not actually getting at the root causes of climate change. Let me give you another example. How many of you know that British Petroleum is responsible for the very concept of the carbon footprint? A couple of you. Here they are calling themselves Beyond Petroleum. So this is supposed to get you to focus on your own contribution to climate change, like eating meat and driving cars. This was a totally genius idea for big oil, because it got us to focus on our own decisions and to feel guilty about them, rather than paying attention to their own huge investments, ongoing investments in climate destruction, including new oil and gas pipelines, new coal mines, which provide that carbon lock-in effect. It's a distraction technique, and it's also worked incredibly well. I can tell you from every semester that I teach climate change, my students are totally focused, or almost entirely focused, on their own carbon footprints. So I say we should be telling stories that keep the guilt where it should be on the relatively small number of companies that are still insisting on fossil fuel expansion against every warning from the IPCC. And let's keep our eyes on activism, and especially collective resistance to big oil. We know they're scared of organized groups who keep public pressure and attention on them, because every time the public starts to get upset about plastics or fossil fuels, they start a new round of deceptive advertising that tries to distract our attention from what they're doing. And in literary studies, I think we make a serious political mistake when we overlook the victories of activists and keep telling stories of unknown futures and apocalyptic hopelessness and powerlessness, and we don't tell the stories of activism that works. So I don't want to end this talk with open-endedness. I want to end it with a model that I've borrowed from the happy endings of 19th century plots of precarity. My closure here is an invitation to you to join the ongoing work of fighting for collective continuance. So if you have a phone or a laptop with you, I'm going to walk you through a couple of websites where you can join the movement. And I invite you to consider joining one of these. Stop ECOP is, it's a pipeline that's being built through Uganda and Tanzania that's awful in every possible way. So it's, first of all, a carbon bomb. It will ECOP stands for the East Africa Crude Oil Pipeline, and millions of tons of carbon will come from it if it's finished. But they're also throwing farmers off their land, they're poisoning the water that people in the area rely on, they're forcing people to sign false contracts, to sign contracts that people themselves can't read because they're in a language that is not their own. And they're also offering false contracts where they're promising remuneration which they're not paying back. And the people involved in Stop ECOP have really want US attention on this, and they have asked repeatedly for us to spread the word. So that's one where you could have a big impact. I was very interested to read about the Stop Project Maple. How many of you know about the Maple Project? Okay, so a couple of you. Enbridge, which is one of the worst of the fossil fuel companies, is planning a very largely expanded pipeline through New England that would be Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and parts of New York. And it is, right now, they're gathering signatures and support to resist this pipeline. New England really does not need that, I promise. Sunrise Brow, some of you may know about. They're doing ongoing and incredible work even after the divestment of fossil fuels, especially looking into, and they're part of a consortium with other universities, undergraduates looking into how fossil fuel money is still coming into the university. And if all else fails, I recommend 350.org. That's Bill McKibben's organization, which is, I think, an incredible organization and very effective. Now, I'm saying that we need collective action, so these are all examples of collective action. And we need lots of people, but interestingly, winning doesn't require all that many people. So research shows that nonviolent revolutions over the past century have succeeded with the support of just 3.5% of the population. So you don't need to persuade everyone. You can ignore the deniers and the skeptics. We do need organized groups willing to keep pressure on the relatively small number of companies that are really responsible for the climate crisis. And that means we do need you. So we would love your help at TIA Divest. I'm going to send around the sign-up sheet. And even if you're not a client, we would love your help. An hour a month is helpful to any activist organization. You don't have to sacrifice a lot. And what I've learned probably most clearly about activist movements is that we don't actually need more protagonists. What we do need are lots of voices raised in a chorus of protest, a huge gathering of minor characters who can take down big oil if we work together. And that is my idea of a happy ending.